This episode is part two of a two-part interview with Jason Arkles, an American sculptor living and working in Florence, Italy. Let's shift gears a little bit. Talk
Yeah,
about your books. You've got, I accidentally deleted some part of it, so I don't have the names of of both your books. But
right.
if you talk about those two, and then I read that you're working on a third one, and I want to know what the
Yeah.
progress is on that.
Okay. So the books that I actually have done, one was basically just it's called Sculpting from Life, a studio manual of the site size method. And this was just to record for posterity the experimental sculpture department at Charles Cecil Studio and record what we had discovered and codified into a teachable technique. So it's a how-to manual of the site size method. I would love to do a second edition of it because it's self-published. I did it in 2006 or something like that, and that was kind of at the dawn of commercially available, like consumer available digital photography, and so the photos aren't the best, and I mean the information is good, but I'd like to update it and make a better book out of it. But that's available. And then 7 or 8 years ago, I published a translation of the first sculpture manual written in Europe by Leon Battista Alberti in 1436. It's called De Statua in Latin, or Della Statua in Italian, and he published within a year of each other this book in both languages, both Latin and Italian. And an English translation hadn't been published in well over 50 years, and I thought it was high time, because also how it had been published in English was as a translation of an historical document, and so the translator really focused on getting the syntax exactly translated and translating it as a text rather than translating it as a sculpture manual. It was written as a sculpture manual, right? Alberti wanted sculptors to read his book and learn from it, and it had never been translated in that way. It was translated as an historical document rather than as a sculpture manual. So I translated it in a very easy to understand vernacular. I'm not worried about getting the exact translation from 15th century Italian exactly correct. I speak in a vernacular. And then I also accompany the text with photographs of work that I produced relative to the text, showing examples of what is being talked about. So I was very happy to do that. Leon Battista Alberti, interesting guy. I actually named my studio here in Florence Studio della Statua, named it after this book. And then the book I'm working on now. Well, this is my magnum opus. This is the book that I started in 2008. It is a translation of the first biography of Francois Rude. Well, no, it's not. It used to be. It's evolved since then. So for years, I thought, okay, I'm going to publish a translation of this very obscure book that I found that details step by step the working process of Francois Rude, who I mentioned is the father of naturalistic sculpture, the guy who sort of invented a body of technique that is very, very related to what I now teach. But it's evolved because there is no decent biography of Francois Rude in English. There are 3 or 4 written in French. So I've spent most of my idle hours during the pandemic translating French texts and writing a commentary to the earliest biography of Rude. But it's more than just a biography. It is an exploration of his technique. There's a step-by-step process included into this original biography that I'm translating, but I'm also writing a commentary to sort of explain the context and also explain the sources for Francois Rude's change. Why did he decide to sculpt differently? Francois Rude was a Prix de Rome winner. He was a darling of the Parisian sculptural scene when he was, in his mid-20s. Why did he then decide to throw away everything he learned at the École des Beaux-Arts? Then it was the École Nationale, and develop from scratch in isolation for 12 years a completely new approach to sculpture. Why did he do that? How did he do that? What were his sources? And so this is something that's never been recorded in a book. No one's ever really studied Francois Rude's technique. And when I saw this in 2008, it's like, oh my gosh, this book needs to be written. And that's what started the podcast. And of course, the podcast got in the way for 5 or 6 years. And now it's only during the pandemic that I can actually have the free time to get back and actually do what I set out to do over 10 years ago and write this damn book.
Wow.
And hopefully it'll be done in a few years. Right. We'll see. We'll see. It is a big task.
Wow. Talk a little bit about your teaching method. I was reading, and I don't know how to pronounce it. Is it écorché or écorché or
écorché?
Écorché.
Yeah.
That it seems like you got 3 different methods of sculpting or teaching sculpting. You got the écorché classes, the quick sketch, and the more detailed classes. And I thought, wow, this is really fantastic, because when I teach painting, one of the things that I try to drum into my students over and over again is that it's better to do a painting a day than try to do this one long drawn out thing, because you'll learn so much more by starting new ones than beating one to death that you're struggling with. But I just thought it was real neat, those 3 different types of classes you taught. Could you speak on those and then segue into the seminars that you do, or workshops that you do in the United States and in the rest of Europe?
Sure, gladly. So the 3 different types you're talking about are actually kind of different areas of sculpture. So écorché, what that is, écorché anatomy. Écorché is the French word for flayed, right? So if you skin something, that thing you have just skinned is now écorché. And so if you've ever seen sculptors or even painters construct in clay a figure, an anatomical figure, muscle by muscle, and so the skin is all removed, and it's just the figure without skin, so you can see all the muscles. That is what an écorché is. So it's a fantastic way to teach human anatomy, right? So that's a study unto itself. Now, then I also teach just my regular standard sight size method, either doing portraits or figures. And I've talked a little bit about what sight size is. And then you mentioned the other one, the composition course. This is something I'm really proud to have, because I don't know of any other sculptor who teaches composition. There are painters who teach composition, and that's fine, but painting composition is not sculpture composition. And it's a mistake to assume that they have much to do with each other at all. Unless you're talking about a relief, it is a different animal. And so I teach the history of sculpture composition, starting with single figures, the history of single figure composition, history of double figure composition, getting into various aspects like significant objects, props, drapery, bases, genres of pose. We're all familiar with the idea of contrapposto, right? We know what that is, where you put your weight on one leg and that kicks your hip on one side, and then you lower your shoulder on the opposite side, and you get this nice S curve in the back, right? Most people are familiar with the idea of contrapposto, but how many people know la figura serpentinata, which is another pose type that was very, very popular at different points of art history? Or talking about what a victory group is. These are genres of sculpture that have developed, and there, as you know, there are no real hard and fast rules of composition. There are things that are tried and true, and you can use them or you can discard them. You can try enough things, and enough people try enough things, and they're successful in the same thing. Sometimes it gets a name, like contrapposto, right? And so I approach the history of composition by tracing the development of composition. So half the course is actually me lecturing. The other half is having students develop compositions on their own based on what they're learning. right in the class in wax, doing small, maybe 3, 4, 5-inch figures in wax. They can make little figures that you can easily bend and pose and change and manipulate. They don't have to look good. The idea is not to produce a nice looking sculpture, but rather to understand how to design in 3 dimensions. I don't know of anyone who's teaching anything like it, sadly, but there it is.
Along those same lines, could you talk, you mentioned about relief sculpture being a completely different animal. And that was going to be one of my questions. And you don't have to get too terribly detailed if you don't want to, but I was thinking that to the uninformed viewer, they would look at a relief sculpture and go, oh, wow, that'd be a whole lot easier because you're not actually in true 3 dimensions. You're just have a raised relief depending on how far you bring it out from a relief on a coin all the way out to, I guess, something like would be on a stone mountain.
Right.
But I suspect that, I sculpt. I do more maquettes for illustration work and just for fun. I paint all day, and then at night when we're watching TV, I sit and I've got a sculpting table in front of the TV, so I sit there and sculpt. But I haven't done any relief sculpting. So can you tell us a little bit about what would be the challenges that's real different with relief sculpting that you don't get with sculpture in the round that might make it even more difficult that people don't even realize?
I can't remember what painter said it, but do you know the saying, painting is easy when you don't know how?
Yeah.
Relief is easy when you don't know how. And terribly difficult when you do. Yeah, so relief sculpture, you could talk about high relief and low relief, and there's a bit of a fuzzy border between that. But basically, high relief is just doing a figure in the round stuck on a background plane. Low relief involves flattening or compressing in some way the forms which you're sculpting, right? So if you're sculpting a human, you're not making the torso fully 3-dimensionally round. You might even just the front half of the torso. You're not doing that. If it's fully projecting as much as the real torso does, then that's high relief, right? So compression of forms, flattening of forms is required to produce a low relief. Then there's a third type of relief called staccato relief, which was invented by Donatello. And staccato relief is a compression of forms like low relief, but done in a very, very particular way. So if you have a certain object, a model, under a light source, you have a light and a shadow pattern, right? What Donatello did was sculpt a relief of that model under that light in a light and shadow pattern and compress his forms in such a way that even his compressed forms cast a light and shadow pattern in his sculpture identical to the light and shadow pattern found on the fully 3-dimensional model. Does that make sense?
Yes. Wow.
Right? And so what that does is provide a much greater illusion of depth that had ever been achieved before, right? So the Parthenon relief friezes and that sort of thing, the metopes and all that sort of thing, those are low relief, right? They're flattened forms, but they're stuck on a background plane. Donatello effectively erases the background plane. It just becomes an infinite background like you see in a landscape painting, right? And so there's this amazing illusion achieved in staccato relief that had never been achieved before. And it's very difficult. Very few people attempt it, but you can most commonly see it in your pocket. Most coins are sculpted in staccato relief. When you see like a nice portrait head, on a coin, hold it up around various sort of raking lights. At a certain point, it'll become so fully 3-dimensional, look beautiful. And that's probably going to be the same light relationship that you're achieving with that coin as the sculptor, him or herself, worked that coin, right? So it's a neat illusion, but it's tricky because you gotta view the finished work under the same lighting conditions under which it was sculpted, right? because it's entirely dependent on the light that hits it.
Well,
So yeah,
I really appreciate hearing this, because I honestly, this was something, anytime you're interviewing people, you try to actually know roughly some of the answers so you can go on. This was something I had absolutely no idea.
right.
What would be the challenges? I assumed that there had to be, but I had no idea. And just listening to you talk about the three different kind of various genres of relief, and I can see where it's a subject that has no end of depth to it,
Yeah.
and challenges.
And I'm certainly no specialist in it. I don't do reliefs often, and when I do, I'm really never satisfied with what I produce. But yeah, there are people who do nothing but that.
Do you do much animal sculpting at all?
No, that's another thing I don't delve into too deeply. Certainly not professionally, simply because there are people who devote their entire careers to animal sculpture or numismatics, medallions, medals, that sort of thing. And so I dare not compete with those people who can do it 10 times better than I ever could, unless I wanted to change my entire focus of what I do. So I like figures. If I'm a specialist in anything, it might be portraiture, especially portraiture in marble. So there are a lot of people who know how to carve marble, and a lot of people who know how to do a nice, beautiful clay bust in clay, but few who can do both. And it's necessary to do both. If you want a beautiful marble bust, the first thing you need to do is produce a good clay bust, because when you create a marble sculpture, and this is something not a lot of people know about, but basically 99 times out of 100, any marble sculpture, any figurative marble sculpture you've seen is the result of a clay model being made first. It's a rough draft, right? You can make your mistakes in clay and fix those mistakes. When you get the clay looking exactly like what you want the marble to look like, then you merely copy your clay. And this goes back to the Greeks, and was revived in the Renaissance and has been with us through today. So two completely different skill sets: modeling in clay and carving in marble. And there are relatively few people who do both, and so that's my specialty. If you want a portrait in clay, or I'm sorry, portrait in marble, I'm your guy.
And is it a whole different mindset doing subtractive as opposed to additive sculpture? Or is it just that it's unforgiving? If you knock off a nose, then that's going to be more difficult to repair in stone than it is in clay.
Yeah, people often ask me, what happens if you knock off a nose? And I say, well, that's when you know that you're a painter. But the truth is, by the time you're getting your big lump of rock down to the point where it starts to have a nose protruding a little bit, you're powering down your chisels and your methods and your hammers, right? So you're not gonna, by the time you're getting a sculpture to look like it has a nose, you're not going to use hammers and chisels in a way that takes off the nose entirely. Any catastrophic failure is going to happen fairly early on, right? And it's usually going to be a fault in the stone itself rather than operator error. Marble takes a long time for a good reason. You're removing very, very small bits. When you're an inch away from the surface, which might sound close, but if you cover your face with an inch of clay, you're going to end up with a sphere. You can't see anything. You don't see eyes, you don't see mouth, you don't see nose, right? An inch is a tremendous amount when you're talking about an inch of material on a sculpture that needs to be removed. So by the time you're an inch away, you're using hammers and chisels in a way that won't split the whole thing in half. After all, it is a rock. Any change to that rock involves, quite a bit of power. And as long as you are mindful of what you are doing with every stroke, you're not going to make mistakes. It's much less risky than it first seems.
Okay, all right. Well, that helps to sort of demythologize that a little bit.
Yeah. I could teach anyone to carve marble. I actually have a student who comes down from the UK every year. Every year there isn't COVID, She's maybe 100 pounds soaking wet. She's approaching 80, and she's in there carving marble all day, and she can get it done.
Yeah. Well, I do know that marble can be repaired. I mean, in some respect, because I know the Pietà was repaired when it was dynamited years ago, and I know that there are people who can uh, glue things back together, but I'm sure that that's a whole lot of time and expense in and of itself.
Sure.
Let's see. One question. Can you talk about, as far as I would be concerned, the mind-numbing experience of sanding? Any of the sculptures I do, I try to make sure, mostly I work in sculpting, which for those who don't know, that's just it's a relatively new substance that it stays uh, pretty much permanently malleable until it's cooked in the oven or baked in the oven. And it's the industry standard in the special effects movie industry. And it's just a quick, down and dirty way to sculpt. But whenever I do them, I try to make sure they're as smooth as I want them to be, because breaking out that sandpaper, oh my gosh, it's just mind numbing. Is there some trick to it that I don't know?
Well, I can't say I'm too proficient in sculpting. Um, uh, before before sandpaper, you might want to try a solvent, perhaps. When you sort of repair or chase or refine work in wax, for instance, if you're going to cast a work in bronze, it needs to be cast or sculpted in wax first. And what you can use in wax is any sort of solvent like turpentine, or some people use lighter fluid even, to sort of melt the surface. And then you use an abrasive sort of scrubby or something to smooth things down. But in terms of marble carving, no, it's all elbow grease. It's not for the timid. But the thing is, you can get a even with a hammer and chisel, you can get a smooth surface from a hammer and chisel. Most of the sanding might just be done to take away the bruising that occurs. You see, when you carve marble, you're not actually cutting marble. Your chisels aren't as sharp as wood chisels. And when you carve wood, you're literally slicing little bits of wood off, right? When you're carving marble, you're using a chisel to break and smash the material in a very controlled manner, right? Marble is crystalline. And when you hit it with a chisel, you're breaking some crystals. And it might even be a smooth surface, but there might be some bruising, which is basically just broken crystal on the surface that creates a discoloration. And so all you're doing when you're polishing marble, even down to a mirror polish, is you're just removing layers of fractured crystal to reveal unfractured crystal. And that's where you get the luminous glow of marble.
Okay,
And so, yeah.
maybe that's where I got a little confused. I think when you were talking about Michelangelo, and I believe you were saying that it took him a year to sculpt the Pietà, but then it took him another year to polish it. It's like,
yeah.
No, homie ain't playing that. So I just, that's where I wanted to ask about the whole polishing aspect.
Well, if you want to make a masterpiece of sculpture, you got to put in the time. One year of your life is a small price to pay to be able to produce the Pietà, I would think.
Very true.
It's not slow. There are no shortcuts. And he might have been doing other things, when he was polishing that thing. But I mean, basically, the Pietà is Michelangelo's most highly finished and most completed sculpture that he ever did. And it's not small. I mean, there's a lot of drapery. He had to get in, and he's doing it all by hand, using sort of what we would think of as fairly rudimentary abrasives. He didn't have sandpaper. He had cloth, and then he would put Tripoli sand, basically sand from the beaches of Tripoli in North Africa, because it's a very sort of particularly abrasive sand. And he would use that. I mean, that's we have it easy nowadays. We can even use machines to do some polishing.
Right.
But when you're talking about the curves, inside a nostril, you're not going to get up there with a grinder, and that's all got to be hand polished. So as much as I like to demythologize the heroic and monumental nature of sculpture and sculptors, I mean, there's that element of truth behind those myths, that it is, it's a lot of work,
Yeah.
and a lot of patience. It's a
Well,
demanding,
I want
taxing.
you to toot your own horn here. I read on your website, you said you are the only American with a sculpture on permanent display. Is it an outdoor permanent display in Florence?
Yeah,
Talk
and you
about
got to
that.
have all those. You got to have all those adjectives, or else the whole thing collapses like a house of cards. So I'm the only American, living or dead, who has a permanent, monumental size marble sculpture on the cityscape of Florence. So it's on the facade of a church. Yeah,
Yes,
life size,
it's
slightly over
beautiful.
life size marble statue of Saint Mark, occupying the niche on the facade of Saint Mark's English church. It's an Anglican church here in Florence that serves the needs of the English-speaking community here.
That is fantastic. I
Yeah, very
loved
proud of
your
it.
I loved your quote, and I won't read it. I've got it in front of me, but you talked about um, your love of commission work, and that you're not necessarily interested in expressing yourself per se, but you like the collaborative aspect of working on commission, which I can really much again relate to, because in my 30-year career, I've been mostly either a portrait painter or an illustrator. I do gallery work and I sell gallery work, but I work a lot on commission, and I really liked what you had to say. So could you share a little bit about that with our listeners?
Sure. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of making sculpture and just sort of putting it out there and hoping someone comes along and buying it. I'm not a fan of the gallery system. I think it's too anonymous. You don't know who's buying it. You don't know why they're buying it. I'd rather make something perfectly suited for a client. So commissions are the way to go, and I see every commission as a bit of a collaboration between the client and myself. I want to be able to give someone what they want. And if my work can even be useful, that's even better. So I'm a big fan of funerary art. Actually, I do quite often. I do sculptures for tombs and funerary monuments and that sort of thing, public monuments, because it serves a need. Someone needs to has a need to memorialize or remember or commemorate a person or a time or a place. And I love that aspect. I love that my sculpture, that my art can be practical. And yeah, in terms of self-expression, um, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just not necessarily what I'm attracted to. And I think I sort of take my first impulses from the fact that I got involved into art through theater, which is a communicative, narrative, storytelling type of art. You're telling a story, and the story is the important thing, and how you express it is the important thing. And then, of course, after a show in the theater is done, it literally doesn't exist anymore. It's kind of one of the things I hated about theater. That you put in all this work and then it just evaporates into memory. That's all you have left is the memory. But sculpture, I prefer to tell stories and craft stories with my work in terms of narrative and allegory. So yeah, I don't need to express myself about how I feel about things will come through in the choice of stories that I choose to tell, and in the way that I choose to tell them. But I don't feel like I need to speak about me, myself. I think there are a lot of amazing stories out there. You don't expect authors to only write about, to only write memoirs and biographies and base everything they write off of their own personal experience.
Right.
Yeah, there are a lot of amazing stories out there. So I'm just a storyteller in my work.
Right. And I will tell the listeners, we don't have to get off on Cellini, but on episode 8, you talk about
Yeah.
Cellini, and I will tell you, if you guys don't listen to anything else, go to episode 8. Cellini is absolutely chilling. He's like the Hannibal Lecter of the art world. And what is really interesting
It's the whole lecture.
is you give do a one-man play
Yeah.
using what I felt like was a Brooklyn accent. And as I was listening, because I've worked in the theater, especially through my son, who works a lot in the theater, and as I was listening, I was thinking, yeah, this guy's had to have had some training in the theater. It is wonderful. That was just a fun thing to listen to,
Yeah, it was
on
a lot of
top
fun to
of
do.
the chilling Cellini history.
Yeah, he's a terrible human being, but a pretty good sculptor.
Yeah. And let's see. Oh, I wanted to ask this because um, I will say that the digital world kind of wrought revenge for visual artists, painters like myself, on photographers, because we had the golden age of illustration in the between about 19, some could argue the 1890s, 1880s, but all the way up to say around 1930 or 40, with the 20s, 30s, 40s being really in many ways the golden age of illustration. And then we were decimated by photography. And photography reigned supreme until the 2000s. And then the digital world came in and just decimated photography. Well, sculpture, kind of for better or for worse, has sort of been a little bit off to the side. It hasn't been affected totally by the technology, at least as far as I could tell. But now, in the age of 3D printing, that's a whole game changer. And I was wondering, do you find that as either a potential threat or maybe a potential opportunity for sculptors, just like casting would be? Or is it even something you think about one way or another?
Yeah, no, it is something I think about a lot, and no, I don't see it as a threat. Just as painters shouldn't see photography as a threat, it's a tool. Norman Rockwell used photographs quite often when he painted, right? When he made his illustrations, and it made his work. You know, he found it worth doing, right? So 3D printing and scanning, that is a fantastic tool, because right now, currently and for the last millennia, if you're a sculptor and you produce something in clay and you want to save it or reproduce it in a final material like bronze, you have to make a mold, right? Which is a negative, just like a photography negative. And from that one negative, you can make many prints of a photograph. From that one mold of a sculpture, you can make many casts. And so when you finish a work in your studio, you make a mold, you maybe make a cast in plaster just to have it around, or maybe you take it off to the foundry to produce in bronze, but then you still have the mold and you have to put it somewhere, right? And so in larger sculpture studios, like my own, actually, I have a lot of space dedicated simply to mold storage, right? Because if I ever want to produce another version, another copy of that sculpture again, I have to have that mold. No mold, no more sculptures. So 3D printing and scanning, what you can do instead of making a mold, you can scan a 3D image of your sculpture. And instead of having an entire room dedicated to storage of molds, which actually break down as well. I mean, a typical rubber mold isn't going to last longer than a decade or so. Instead of having an entire room dedicated to that, you just have a thumb drive, right? And not only that, you can print it in any size or scale you want. You can edit it on a laptop. You can change it. You can alter it. You're not locked into that original form that you started with. So it's got tremendous potential that sculptors today are taking advantage of and have been taking advantage of for a decade or so. So it's not something that's going to come along and replace sculpture, because you still need to make the original in some sort of material. Now, yes, you can scan anything you want. You can scan a human being. And if you think that the apogee of sculpture is to produce something that is indistinguishable from a human in real life, well, then that's your thing. but sculpture is an art. It's not about producing an exact copy of what you find in nature, just like painting isn't, and just like, frankly, photography isn't, right? There's a lot of art that goes into changing the mood and the atmosphere, and even the point of view, the perception of the object in a photograph is manipulated by a photographer. So 3D scanning only gets you that raw material of, exactly what you find in nature, and doesn't sort of apply any art for you. You still have to come along and change it, manipulate it, and put your stamp on it, and draw the focus where it needs to be. There's so much more that sculpture is capable of that a 3D printer, and scanner system can produce. So certainly not a threat. Absolutely a tool. I think in generations to come, people won't be making molds as often as they'll just be scanning and storing that file, and making it easier, making it cheaper, and making it more accessible. Right? There's a problem with sculpture and painting, as opposed to all the digital media that we have, and this has been our problem for a century, is that you can distribute a film and millions of people can all see it on the same day. You can put something on Netflix or on television or on Spotify, and millions of people have instant and free access to it. Painting and sculpture, not so. You can show photographs of paintings, you can show photographs of sculptures, but it's not painting, it's not sculpture. But if you're able to put a sculpture on a digital file and send it across the world for someone else to print up and actually have physically in front of you, that is a democratization of the experience of sculpture that has no parallel in the history of art. Right? So that's something that's really exciting. You remember 20 years ago when people were all up in arms about Napster, the file sharing website application where people could suddenly download any song they wanted for free, and people thought, oh, that's going to be the end of the music industry. And what it did was actually, it was a boon to the music industry, because people were exposed to more types of music than they could ever possibly pay for, and then they chose to pursue with their pocketbooks avenues of music that they might never have known about. Imagine a sculpture Napster. Imagine people collecting files of sculptures, whether it's originals or maybe scans of the classics, and printing out a little tiny mini museum of their favorite sculpture in their house. Right? That would enable people to pursue a casual interest in sculpture the way they can't today. If you want to go see a sculpture, you got to go to a museum. And the only people who go to museums and galleries are museum goers and gallery goers, and that's a tiny fraction of the population at large. So I see it as a furtherance of the democratization of art.
This kind of segues into a question I was thinking about. I know how to make a living as a painter, but as as a sculptor, I know some things. Like, again, I've said I work in the movie and film industry, or TV industry, so I know I do digital special effects, but you can also do what are called practical special effects. So you're building 3D models, and then same thing in the theater, and of course in the toy development industry. They need sculptors there to sculpt the little action figures and so forth.
Sure, collectibles are a big market in sculpture.
Yes, and I can think of ice carvers and some other things, but okay, you got someone who's got a teenager who wants to be a sculptor, and mom and dad show up at your atelier and say, okay, that's all well and good. How can little Juan or Luigi, how are they going to make a living in sculpting? So
all right.
Can you give us some?
Yeah, I got an answer for this, because I get asked a lot. So I know 100 successful artists, and they're all successful in their own way. So if you think you're going to be able to plug yourself into a system where all I need to do is go to this school and get my degree, and then I become a sculptor, or all I need to go do is this atelier and put my time in at this atelier and then come out and then, apply to the right, competitions or exhibitions, then I'm going to be an artist, right? Every artist I know who is successful in their own way because they followed their interests and their strengths, right? So if you think you can look at anyone else who is successful in art and say, well, I'll just copy their career path, unless you're exactly like them, it's not going to work for you. You need to know who you are as an artist, what you like, what you want to do. If you don't want to be spending your time producing anonymous, small standing bronze nudes, pretty little ballerinas and dancers and otherwise anonymous, nameless nudes, then don't pursue the gallery system, because that's what sells, right? But if your thing, if like what you want to do is like, oh yeah, I'm all about the little nude ladies, I could totally spend my career knocking those out, then yes, then the gallery system is for you. All right. So you need to find out what your interests are and of course what your strengths are. And then go with that. And if there is no market that is obvious for your interests and strengths, frankly, all the better. It means you don't have any competition. You could be the person doing what you do and have no competition. And then you need to develop your market, because every artist needs to develop their market. You don't walk into a marketplace and just be like, okay, everybody, I'm here. Who's first? Which client is going to be the first one? No, you have to develop a brand that is absolutely personal to you. You have to develop your market. And I know that sounds very terrible and crappy and like, oh God, it's a business. And yeah, it is. If you want to make money, you have to pay attention to some extent to that sort of thing. But if you don't follow your interests and your strengths, then you're doing yourself a disservice. So my interests, early on, I saw myself as a purist. I'm in the city of Michelangelo. It's like, I'm going to do marble. I love marble. Actually, even before I became a sculptor, I was working construction as a stonemason. So I had an attraction to stone and hammers and chisels, and I love that sort of stuff. And so it's like, okay, great, that's my interest. I also happened to go to a school, Charles Cecil Studio, where the specialty is portraiture. If you want to be a portrait painter in oils, Charles Cecil is one of the best places to study on earth. If you want to be any kind of other painter, any other kind of painter, then it might not be the best place, because it literally is focused on nothing but portraiture in oils. So I combine my interests and my strengths and and so I'm a portrait sculptor in marble, and there are very few people who do what I do, and even fewer who do it as well as I do.
There you go.
So that's what I would tell anyone. Don't, back to your, to the parents of Luigi, they're asking me how their son will become an artist. That's entirely up to him. It's entirely up to him. He's got to be brave enough and be strong enough to pursue his interests and his strengths, despite of the fact and actually because of the fact that no one else is doing what he's doing. You need to make your own way.
Yeah. I guess it's really one of my last questions that I just have on hand. In episode 23, you talk about Inside the École des Beaux-Arts. And I mean, I've always loved their work, but the work of the 19th century, but I had no idea how prodigious their memories were. I knew just in my reading and other lectures I've listened to, people would talk about that they had, great capacity for memory in the 19th century. But when you talked about that, those sculptures that we see now, that we go, okay, well, yeah, they're beautiful and all, but those were actually created strictly from memory, that you were saying that they had to do their sketches, they would be put away in a vault, and then they do all of it from memory, and then it would be compared later to those sketches. Now, they weren't any different than us, so obviously they were doing some things to build that muscle memory or memory muscle. What
Mhm.
do you have techniques? And correct me if I was wrong on any of what I just said. That's what I
I
remember.
think I actually think you might be slightly misunderstanding. Yeah, in the concourse for the Prix de Rome, at an initial stage, they were given a theme that they had to develop a composition on, right? And they would make a small clay or wax sketch of that composition. Then they had to realize that same composition on a larger scale, but they could use models and that sort of thing. So it wasn't that they had to reproduce exactly their sketch, obviously, because those sketches needed to be done in a single day, so they weren't detailed. What they had to remember was just the pose, the composition, how far the head was turned, where the positions of the arms and legs were. So it wasn't as though they produced a sculpture in a day and then months later had to produce an exact copy of that same sculpture. Rather, they were locked into their initial idea of composition.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay. Yes.
So yeah, they might not have had even fingers on the hand, but the hand better be in the same place as it was in the sketch.
Okay. Well, still, that's a tremendous amount of memory work that's involved.
Well, if you know what's coming up in the Prix de Rome, and if you know that the Prix de Rome can set your entire career in motion, you're going to work on that.
Do you have exercises that you put your students through where they build their muscle, their memory muscle?
Well, I mean, just the practice of sight size actually does it to some extent, because with sight size, I mentioned that there's a reliance on a certain relation of a spatial relationship in the studio. So you've got your model, your live model across the room. Your work, if you're working on a smaller scale, is going to be maybe 5 or 10 feet in front of that model. And then your point of observation, at which point your model and your sculpture are exactly the same size, is going to be 5 feet away from your model. So anytime you're actually looking at your work or looking at the model, you might be 10 feet away from your work, right? So you're constantly walking back and forth and back and forth. I mean, you could literally cover miles in a single session, constantly going back. Sometimes you don't even stop. So what you're doing, you're coming back to your point of observation where everything is one-to-one, right? You're looking at your work, you're comparing the model, you're deciding what to do. Then you actually walk towards your sculpture. When you get there, then you have to make those changes. But it doesn't behoove you to then look at your model at that position, because then you're much closer to your clay work than you are your model, and so things are going to be out of proportion. So you can't really utilize the model very fruitfully in a lot of circumstances when you're actually close enough to your clay to change, right? And so you have to have a memory of being back at your point of observation, remembering what you're going to work on and what shapes you're trying to go for. You go up to your figure and then you work for maybe 2 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. And then you come back to your point of observation and check. There's always there's constant, confirmation of what you're doing. So you're walking back and forth constantly. Yeah. So in that sense, it does build memory.
Yeah. And one of the things that I love about doing this program is that, I'm in my studio working. And so I work usually about 10 or 12 hours a day. And I just come in and I have podcasts and things like that on while I'm working. And it's very exciting. It's very fulfilling. As a matter of fact, the one you did on Rude, I believe, with the Arc de Triomphe, I was actually working on an illustration painting of that. And so it was so cool to be sitting there doing that. And then I realized you were doing your lecture on it. But it's easy, as you could tell from some of the questions that I've asked, it's easy to misconstrue or just not quite understand totally what's the train of thought that the lecturer is doing. And so it's so fun to actually talk to that person and sometimes, just get a Q&A and sometimes kind of get your thoughts corrected or put back into a straight line. And, we have been going for almost 2 hours.
Yes,
This
we
is-
have.
This has been absolutely delightful, and
Wonderful.
I would I wanted to ask you, was there anything else that you wanted to share with the listeners? I'm actually going to break this probably into two episodes because it's so rich and wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to share with your listeners about yourself, your work, how to get in touch with you, anything?
Well, yeah, you can always get in touch with me. I'm very approachable by email and all that sort of thing. JasonArkles.com is my website. You can always reach me through that. And if you're interested in taking lessons, you actually asked me, one of the few questions I didn't answer was about my travel workshops. In days of non-COVID, I spend several months a year giving workshops all over the world, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Great Britain. And when I'm not doing that, I am happily ensconced in my studio in Florence, in a beautiful studio in a Renaissance palace right on the river, right in the center of Florence. It's pretty amazing. And you can always come and join me here and take private lessons from me. I don't teach regular classes. I don't have like a regular, academic year or anything like that in my studio. I only do private and semi-private lessons. I find that much more rewarding and enjoyable, and I think the students do too. So if you have a hankering, come out to Florence. I'll teach you how to sculpt in the city of the Renaissance.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you for being on the show.
My
Thank you,
pleasure,
guys.
really. I've really enjoyed it.
Yes, sir. Thank you guys for listening. I'm Bill Wilson, and I'm the Arthropologist. If you've enjoyed this episode of The Arthropologist, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more episodes like this, think about subscribing. I'm Bill Wilson, and I'm the Arthropologist.